Romantics! I am so excited about today's episode. It is just something that I've been, ever since I heard about this TV series, I knew I had to do an episode about it, and I'm so glad to have with me today Perry Constantine. And I'm not going to say he's our nerdy romantic comic expert, but at the moment, yes, he is. So today we are talking about X-Men 97. It's an animated series and it follows the X-Men animated series of the 90s, hence why it's called 97. And we're going to talk about the title, we're going to talk about nostalgia, we're going to talk about a whole lot of things on this episode. And I'm excited about all of it. So stay tuned. This is the Nerdy Romantics Podcast, and I'm your host, Y.M. Nelson. All right, Perry, how are you doing today?
I am doing very well, and I am very excited to talk about this with you. Last time I was on, I told you have got to watch this show, because I knew you were a fan of the original.
Yes. And I'm so glad that you reminded me about this show, because I will say that, and yeah, I'm just going to get right into it. How I first heard about X-Men 97 is I follow Black Nerd Comedy, Andre. I follow him on Instagram and on YouTube, just about everywhere he is online. And he mentioned he had an Instagram post that talked about this series coming out. And when I saw that post, I was just like, oh my gosh, I've got to watch this. I really have to watch this. I was so psyched, but I was in the middle of a semester, so I had all three of my jobs going, and I put it on the back burner. And then, Perry, when you were talking to me about this after the last episode that we recorded, which, talked about our superhero movies, I just got giddy about it all over again. And probably about, I would say, a couple of weeks after that, I just started watching. And I am in awe. Perry, you've got to tell me how you found out about this. What were you thinking? What was going through your mind before you started watching?
So, I grew up with X-Men 92, right? That is one of the things, that and Batman the Animated Series were like my gateway drugs into comic books. After watching the series, I started getting into the X-Men comics, and it just all kind of snowballed from there, which is how I became the comic book expert on this show. And it all really starts with X-Men 92. But a few years ago, I had rewatched it when it came on Disney Plus, and to be honest, it did not age well. I really started to see some of the seams in it. The animation is kind of jerky. The first season especially, it was very obvious they were just kind of winging it, because they kept breaking all the continuity they established in the first season later on. And so it doesn't hold up very well. So when they announced that they were going to do a sequel series to it, my first thought was, I feel like that series kind of ran its course. I don't know what else there is to get. What I was really hoping for was either maybe a completely new series, or about maybe 10 years ago, there was an animated series called Wolverine and the X-Men, which only lasted one season, but was amazing. So I would have, and it ended on a cliffhanger too. So I really kind of wanted to see a sequel to that. So I was, not pessimistic, but not really enthusiastic going into this. But then I saw the trailer. And when I saw the trailer, I'm like, oh, okay, this has got my attention.
Yeah.
And then that first episode, because I was watching it week to week on Disney Plus, and I watched that first episode. I'm like, all right, well, let's see how it is. And I tell you, from the moment those first chords started of the intro, it's like I was 9 years old again.
Yes.
It was just like it was amazing. And then I saw that first episode, and it blew me the hell away. I was not expecting it to be as good as it was. And then after that, it just got. And for the most, I'm just like, okay, I know where this is going. I can see the beats coming because I'm familiar with all the comics, and they pulled a lot from the comics here. So I'm like, okay, there's that. And I figure, like, I'm enjoying this, but it's not going to surprise me. And then, episode 5. Holy crap.
Yeah. Oh, boy. Episode 5. We're going to talk about that. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was major. But, you are saying a lot of the same things that were going through my mind when I first started watching. For me, it really was like I was being transported back in time to when I first started watching this. And it's interesting too, Perry, because that's kind of how I got started into the whole superhero thing. Now, I never made it into comic books. I'll
get you one of these days.
Yeah, you're going to get me. You're going to get me. I'm telling you. I actually, this is a total side story, but this is very, 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 very coincidental. So last weekend, I went to Soda City Comic-Con, which is in Columbia, South Carolina. And I went, this was my first Comic-Con that I actually went to. I can't believe I'm saying that. But yes, this is the first Comic-Con that I've actually gone to. And it just so happens that at that Comic-Con was part of the X-Men 97 cast. Voice actors. Yes. I was just like blown away. Because, as we're going to talk about in a little bit, it's not just the intro music that, is giving nostalgia. Some of the actors voiced the original, and they are back in X-Men 97. In fact, a lot of them are, and I got to see them, and it was just a whole, eye-opening experience for me, being at a Comic-Con, but also realizing that there is this huge community of fans. And I mean, this is a smaller Comic-Con. This is nothing like San Diego, This is a smaller Comic-Con, but they are just as, I don't want to say rabid because that sounds so negative, but they are just as enthusiastic about this show as I was. And so to hear you say yes, I was transported. I felt all these things. I had all the feels, it's so, it's all very full circle. I'm feeling all very full circle moment right now.
Yeah.
But, getting back to the whole nostalgia and everything of that, you're right. It's not just, you hear those notes of the intro song, and you're like, oh my gosh, I think I've been transported. But then right along with that, you see the intro video, you see the animation, you see the whole intro, and it's basically like the same theme. It's the same, of course there's like a couple of different characters or, here and there, in the intro, but it's basically the same intro. They just updated.
There's the same, yeah. Yeah, they updated with, although I gotta say, one thing that's always kind of bugged me about the intro, both the original and the new one, how come when Cyclops gets his spotlight title card moment, he's the only one who never wears his costume?
Right. Yeah. What is that about?
I've always wondered why, because they show Wolverine, he transforms into his costume, but
yes,
Cyclops, he just never wears the costume in his title card sequence. I always found that kind of weird.
Yeah, he doesn't. It's just, yeah. It's just, it's almost like, and two, because he's on that, hill or whatever, he just looks like he's having a
Mm,
moment, He looks like he's having
yeah.
a crisis moment. Everybody else is in full on, we're ready to fight. And he looks like he's in crisis. It's so weird. But he is in crisis a lot, I guess. I don't know.
One of the things speaking of Cyclops, though, one of the things that, and I think turned off a lot of people to his character was his depiction in that 92 series, because he was always
Yes.
kind of like, this uptight Boy Scout, and the 90s and in their defense, he was kind of like that in the 90s comics too, and he was kind of, kind of a boring character in both the comics and in the show. And then it wasn't until later when I kind of dove into the comics and read more about him and saw stuff that like Grant Morrison did with him or Josh Whedon, and then I'm just kind of like, oh wow, Cyclops is actually a badass. And then this show, it really turned the page on him, and it made him a lot more like the Cyclops I love from the comics.
Yeah, I will say this show raised my respect for him because I was totally, if there is a love triangle, okay, for all of y'all Twilight folks, y'all do not know a love triangle. This is a love triangle. Wolverine, Jean Grey, and Cyclops. That is the soap opera of the century sometimes. But I was always on Wolverine's side, even though I knew that was not going to happen. Because Wolverine just can't, yeah. He just, no. But, and so I had a little bit of, I say all that to say, I look down on, Scott Summers. I'm just like, you're just, yeah, no. I'm like, no, you're just weak. I don't like you. I just had, feelings about him. But seeing him in this series, or in this, in this series, I've found a new respect for him. And especially like him as a dad, and they go through all those family things, the family stuff that they go through. I mean, this shows him in such a good light, here.
And that opening intro of him when he bursts into the Friends of Humanity headquarters, and he's he's blasting to cushion his fall, he's blasting to like slide across the room,
Right.
like they showed his powers in an amazing way.
And it's not just they show his powers, but it's also like one of those fight sequences for those of you who just got into the whole superhero thing with the MCU, and you had those moments with those fight scenes where they're fighting and they're being all badass, but then at the same time they're making quips. They're like, okay, son, I got this, move out the way, kind of thing. I mean, he had all of that going in that first sequence. I was like, this is really cool. I'm like, okay, Cyclops, all right, we got you, all right. I see where you're going with this.
And one of the things about the animation style, because the original, it was really heavily based on Jim Lee's art style, which, if you ever seen Jim Lee's art in the comic books, it's like this kind of like hyper detailed kind of style, which doesn't translate very well animation, so that's why if you watch those old episodes, it's very kind of jerky. There are all these shadows on them that don't quite seem to fit very well.
Yes.
And here they went with a much more simplified style that's much more suited to animation. And I think that's one of the things too that makes those fight scenes flow so much better, is the animation is much better suited to it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's okay. Now that makes total sense, because as I, obviously I went back and I at least watched a few episodes. I haven't gone through a lot of those episodes. I'm just so blown away by 97. I'm just like, oh my, but now going back through and seeing a few more of those episodes, it's almost like when you see the original episodes, you're looking at basically comic books on screen. But here I feel like I'm looking at actual animations, versus comic book on screen. So
right.
yeah,
I think that's one of the things that made like Batman the Animated Series kind of withstand the test of time a little bit better is because that animation is just smooth as butter. So when you look at something like this, and it's obvious they're taking more of a cue from that kind of style and like the more kind of anime influence stuff where it's focused on, we got to keep these drawings kind of simple so that the animation can flow nicely.
Right. I totally see that. All of that makes sense now. That makes sense to somebody who's kind of got the untrained eye. You still can tell the difference, and also kind of going back to what you were saying about, how, you heard this was coming out, you went back, you went back before you heard this was coming out, you went back and you saw some of the older episodes. And in looking at them visually, they do kind of take you out of the whole, like, why was I watching this again? You're kind of like, what? But then at the same time, you have to think in the 90s, they did not have HD TV like they do, now. It's not the same thing.
No HD, no 4K, none of that stuff. Yeah, it was very different time, and a lot of stuff told, like you look at the Batman or the DC stuff from back then, or some of the later animation stuff from like the early 2000s, that holds up a little bit better because I think they started leaning on a more anime style approach where it was more focused on that. But besides that, they'd also done a few little like minor cosmetic changes with some of the characters. Like I really like what they did with Bishop, for example, because if you go back and you watch, it feels like Bishop is a completely different character from the one in the original, because he was kind of irritating in the original in the original series, like for the future,
right?
He's got the shortcut with like the short dreads and everything, and he's got this like cool laid back persona, and I really dug Bishop in this series, and I'm kind of disappointed that he exited so soon.
Well, I'm kind of disappointed that he exited so soon as well. But, I just happened to watch the last episode again very, very recently, as in like an hour ago. And I'm like, if they have a season 2 of this, it looks like he's going to get some more airtime. Yeah.
My favorite was after episode 5, when I'm watching that episode 6 and the opening credits start, and you've got Nightcrawler there in the opening credits. And Nightcrawler is like one of my favorite X-Men. So I flipped out when I saw that.
I bet you did. Yeah.
And he was a character that I didn't really know much about Nightcrawler in the comics at first, because he wasn't part of the X-Men when I was reading back in the 90s. So, and when I saw him on the animated series, he was just kind of like, he's very preachy, this monk kind of character. He's always talking about like God's love and all that. And, me being an atheist, I was like, all right, whatever. But then I read him in the comics, and he's basically like the Marvel Earl Flynn. Like he's very charming. He's very kind of, he's like a pirate at heart, basically. And so when I watch him back in that original series, I'm just like, they don't really do a good job with him in that episode he appeared in. And then when he appeared in this, it's like they decided, we're making him much more like the Nightcrawler in the comics, because he was charming, he was smooth, he had that whole swashbuckling personality. And that scene with him and Wolverine when the Sentinels attack was probably the best fight scene in the entire series.
Right. Oh gosh, totally, like amazing. He's like, okay, 6, no, 9. I'm like, yes. I mean, and they're fighting, and it's just, that scene was totally amazing, and it gives a little more of a round character to Nightcrawler. I've always seen him be totally that secondary character, even in the X-Men like movies. And I mean, he's like one of the first ones you see in the X-Men movie. And why are they treating him like a secondary character, right? But here, I think I learned more about his character by watching this series than I have from watching anything else with him in it. Because
this is Yeah, he was in the Pride of the X-Men pilot, which was Marvel's first attempt at doing a X-Men animated series.
Okay.
He was in that. He was in obviously X2,
Mm-hmm.
played by Alan Cummings, and then he was in X-Men Apocalypse and Dark X, played by, I can't remember the guy's name, Corey or Smith McKee or something like. I can't remember the guy's name. I'm sorry, but very like Alan Cummings did a great job, but he was real. The script didn't do him a whole lot of favors, and then what they did with him in Apocalypse and in Dark Phoenix was just insulting. And then he was also in Wolverine and the X-Men, the animated series, and he was pretty good in that. And X-Men Evolution, was okay. But it was more focused on like kind of like, you know, teenage Nightcrawler, so it was a little bit more of like an exaggerated portrayal. But this one, hand down, in these few episodes he's been in, they from like that first scene he's in Genosha, they captured him perfectly.
Yeah. This is a really good portrayal of him. You know, you mentioned Apocalypse, and you know we're gonna have to come back to Apocalypse because that's another whole can of worms. But that's also another place where I feel like they really, the characters. Oh my gosh, why did they do this to those characters? But anyway, I do want to kind of talk a couple more about some other characters. So I'll say I have two favorites. When I first started watching X-Men in the 90s, two favorites came out, and my first favorite is obviously Storm, because I see, because representation. And two, I mean, she was just like badass. I mean, she is controlling the weather. The weather, people. I thought, okay, yeah, this is apropos. Yeah. But the other character that, really stood out to me, that I really, when I heard that X-Men was actually coming to screen, to the theater screens, was Gambit. Gambit, total crush on Gambit. I mean, and he was just, I just loved his character. And then when the first X-Men movie came out, to see Rogue having this crush on Wolverine, it just threw me off. And of course, Gambit actually doesn't show up until, what's the movie with
X-Men Origins Wolverine?
Yes, right. So, and of course, everybody that was in that movie seemed to want to bury that movie. Ryan Reynolds has jokes about it for days. I mean, it's just, yeah. But
have you seen Deadpool and Wolverine yet?
I have not seen it yet, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, I've got to see this movie. But I haven't seen it yet.
I don't know if appearance has been spoiled for you yet or not, but I think you'll be very happy.
Okay, no, I don't think I've been too spoiled. I've been sort of spoiled a little bit. But I've been trying to stay away until I can watch it. Try not to be spoiled. But, I've also just kind of been in a little bit of a funk. So I do need that to kind of, I know it's going to be a lot of laughs. So I can't wait for that. Another thing that's a lot of laughs is, just the character dialogue in here in X-Men 97 is amazing. And it is one of the things that I really remember from the 90s really loving, because the dialogue this is not a kid's animation. It is, kids can watch it, yes, but adults are going to get so much out of this. I mean, it's a little bit elevated. It's not just, hey, this is a fluffy kids, kind of whatever. It could almost hold its own a little bit side by side with some of the soap operas and some of the action dramas of the 80s and 90s, like the A-Team and, Remington Steele and all those kinds of things. I mean, I love the dialogue. I love the quips. I love all of it. And I feel like to a certain extent, X-Men the animated series, did the sarcasm and the sarcastic quip first. They did it before the MCU and Iron Man started doing it, and they've done it well. I'm still in awe that still comes out, that there's quips, there's, these characters are, alive to me in a way that I wasn't sure if they were going to hold up, because like I was trying to say kind of a little bit before, I did watch a few of the episodes before, and I was like, part of the reason was, why did I like this? And that was part of kind of how I was feeling. It's like, why did I like this in the 90s? Because I remember who I was in the 90s. I was like, this was a little bit, different for me. And then Wolverine starts making his sarcastic jokes, and people start, saying all sarcastic things, and Rogue with her, with herself. I mean, I think, if you could curse in a cartoon, she would probably do it, and Wolverine would probably do it. But it then reminded me of kind of why I liked it, back in the day, was because of the, yeah.
I think dialogue too. I think there's a massive improvement on it in this series, because rewatching the old episodes, there's good dialogue in there. Don't get me wrong, but there's also a lot of kind of overwrought expository dialogue, and that comes a lot from the influence of the comics at the time, and a lot of them was influenced by the comics that Chris Claremont wrote in the 80s. So, and Claremont does a lot of things great. Dialogue, he's always been kind of overwrought on. So that didn't translate so well into the original series. But this one, they took a much more modern approach, and the dialogue here slaps. It is really good. It is on point, and this whole series just a masterpiece, how to do, because this is a trend with media in the past 10, 15 years or so, is to go back and bring back these old series that have been canceled or dormant.
Yep.
And it's let's be honest, it's not always good. I mean,
right.
A lot of times it falls flat on its face. I mean, you had the Arrested Development season 4 was just awful, and and some of them too, just don't work as well when you go back to it. But this one, it perfectly captures that original feel was, and then it elevates it, right? It doesn't get mired in the nostalgia of it. There is nostalgia. It's nostalgia bait from at the beginning, but once you get in, they're off to the races, and they're doing a lot of different things with it.
Right. Yeah. And so that is what I think makes this sing, is that it is not a do-over. It is a continuation. Let's take what you loved from the 90s series and let's create something that you will still love in 2024. But also, if you are totally new to this, let's keep your interest peaked, because again, some of our younger generations are going to look, for 3 seconds at something, make a judgment, and then move on, right? But this has you hooked. And it's not because it's baked in nostalgia. That's what got me. But what's going to get the younger generations is not and keep the younger generations is not necessarily just rehashing. That's what I don't like about, what they've been doing with some of these reboot kind of things. It's been just what it is, just what I've said, a reboot. How many iterations of Ghostbusters are we going to have? Come on. But with this, It is, let's pick up the first thing that they did that was genius in my opinion is pick this up right where we left off. So basically it's just like the storyline picks up right where it's left off. So not only do you get this totally new series, but you also get the connection to the series that it was. So you're going to get people going back and watching, not just us for nostalgia, but people who are just getting into this right now. You're going to get them going back and watching and trying to figure out, okay, what does this character have to do with this? And what does this character have to do with that? And, you know, what about these Sentinels? And what about this? You know, you're going to get all of that, right? But then the other genius thing that they did was up the ante, which is basically what you're saying. It's kind of up the ante. This storyline. Now, they did some part 1s, part 2s, part 3 kind of things, but it was more episodic in the old days. And I believe you were saying to me before we started recording, and I didn't even realize this, but yeah, they did a season 1 and then they trashed everything kind of, and then they just kind of cobbled together. Yeah. So I'm like,
because they didn't actually know that they were going to get more than a season, and didn't actually even have, like, I had heard of you with some of the people who worked on the original show, and they were saying, and this is going back a few years now, so I might be misremembering things, but I remember them saying that they didn't have like a dedicated writing team for it. So it was just kind of like they were kind of playing jazz that whole first season. And when they get into the later seasons and they get into some of the character flashback stuff, that's why you have weird things like, you know, in season 1, Rogue, Pyro, and Avalanche have no idea who each other is. Rogue has no idea that Mystique is her father mother, and then later on you get a flashback episode where Rogue is training with Pyro and Avalanche. So you had Angel in the first season who seemed to have no knowledge of the X-Men, but then in later seasons he appears in flashbacks with the original X-Men. So it was really kind of confusing. Weird. A kid was like, wait a minute, how do these things work together?
Right. But here in this series, or in this season of this series, they have upped their game by creating a story that basically you can, even though they did put it out week to week to week, you can basically binge watch this. So they were writing for today. And I think they got a good 1-2 punch here with that. And I think that's kind of what makes this better than some of the other reboot kind of things that we're seeing, and some of the rehashing of and bringing out, you know, old characters and things that we've seen lately. But yeah, what were you going to say?
I think I was going to say the episodic structure, the week to week release. You're right. It is. You know, it's very bingeable, this series. Like, you can sit down, watch it in a weekend, no problem. But one of the things that they did really well, too, was breaking it up into those weekly installments, because it created this. I mean, I don't know if you're on Threads at all, but on Threads, while this was airing week to week, it was the best place to be if you were an X-Men fan, because it was just like everybody was talking about this on Threads every week. You know, people were all, you know, excited about it, and it was like the most fun I've had on social media probably ever. It was a wonderful. It was just, and it was pure positivity and joy. It was people ranting and stuff like that. It was just talking about how much they love it, and, you know, questions about what might be coming next and all that stuff. And it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and you know, you saying that, I got on Threads after this went out, but the way that you're saying that is kind of how people were on Twitter when Scandal was on, you know, showing week to week. Everybody was live tweeting when that was a thing. They were live tweeting Scandal like nobody's business. It was, yeah. it was kind of it was frenzied, but a good frenzy.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
I was live threading, I guess you would say,
Yeah.
during Ep 5. And they're pulling stuff like this and this and this from the comics that my next thread was, and then I got to that moment. My next thread was, holy shit. And that was it. That was all I could say.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. I mean, episode 5, let's get into it. Episode 5. Episode 5 for me was when I had been binging this pretty much, like I just, was just sitting and watching for, I would watch like, a few episodes, but I was pretty much binging until episode 5. And then at episode 5, I was like, what? Yeah. Now, remember what I said about who my 2 favorite characters were. Remember what who one of those characters were. So I'm just sitting there with my mouth open and crying at this animated thing, right? Crying. But I should say at this animated thing because I cried a lot of animated stuff. But I'm just like, I thought this was a superhero show. And I am sitting here crying like this was, terms of endearment or something. I was just like, I was almost to the point of bawling. And at that moment, I said, okay, I have to stop watching. So I stopped watching for like a couple of weeks. And then I came back.
Oh, wow. You really took a minute.
Yeah, I did. Part of it was, work stuff. So that always does it. But the other part of it was I did need to take a minute because I was like, what in the world? I was just like, OMG. Oh, I couldn't wrap my mind around what I had seen. And it took me a minute, but then I came back to it and I was like, why did I stop watching this? I love this show. I was like, I know I had an emotional moment, but I love this show. And I came back and I just started binging it again. But I did need to take a moment. And I think everybody needed to take a moment. It's so funny because I was at Comic-Con, they were talking about episode 5 and everybody's like, episode 5, and everybody has that moment or whatever. But for me, I think that's when X-Men kind of, it just got real for me. Not that it wasn't real before, but it just got really real that episode.
So one of the things I loved about that was it basically put the whole Wolverine, Jean, Cyclops love triangle to bed, right? And
yes, yeah.
She has all this confusion after she's been cloned. She doesn't know where her memories end and Madeline's begins. Their memories are all messed up here and jumbled together. And when did this switch happen? And she's confessing this confusion she has to Wolverine, and she kisses him, and he pulls back and he says, "You have to talk to Scott."
Right?
And it comes directly out of the Grant Morrison comic run because there was a similar situation where just feeling confused after Scott had been possessed by Apocalypse. Long story.
Oh Lord!
But and so he kisses him. And then he pulls away and he says, "We both know the deal. It would never work with us." And one of the things I love about that I think this series gets across that the original series did not is that Scott and Logan, they have very different approaches to things, but they respect the ever-loving hell out of each other.
Yeah. And I agree. And it totally gets that across here. And you're right. It doesn't necessarily do that in the 90s comic at all. It's more about, Wolverine hating on everything Scott's doing.
Right.
Or
Yeah.
Logan hating on everything that Scott's doing and making fun of him too. See, that's the other thing, is the making fun is just amped. So if you're making fun of somebody, it's like, do you really respect this person?
Right.
But yeah, you're right. That scene does it. One other thing I will say too about episode 5 is you learn a lot about who Rogue is, where Rogue has really come from, what her connection to Magneto is about. If you don't read the comics, okay. I'm not sure how much of that is close to the comics, period.
It's very close.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very close.
But
another thing that I loved was they switched the love triangle focus from Scott, Jean, and Logan, Rogue, Gambit, and Magneto.
Yeah. So it's like, oh no. Is this where we're going with this? But also, what it shows for me is it shows that the first X-Men was even more wrong than what I previously thought, right? So, because they didn't even get that, but then also she's pretty much a child, so showing, the way that's cast, I mean,
Yeah.
That's
the
Sir
other thing.
Ian
Yeah,
is really too old for her.
Right. And it's also, when the original show came out, like they had done because the Rogue and Gambit stuff, or the Rogue and Magneto stuff, actually happened before Rogue and Gambit even met in the comics. So it was, she had been a member of the X-Men,
right?
And so had Magneto, and they both ended up in the Savage Land together, and they had gotten very close. They hadn't really consummated or anything like that, but there was like hints of something happening there between them. And later on in the comics, when Magneto turned villainous again, there was still some hints of stuff that there's like some romantic tension between the two of them. But what really kind of drove it home was two things: is that there was a storyline in the mid-90s called Age of Apocalypse, where the entire timeline was changed, and it was this entire new reality where Xavier had died years before he had a chance to form the X-Men, and that basically led to Apocalypse being able to take over North America almost unchallenged, because there were no X-Men around to stop him. And Magneto and created the X-Men in Xavier's memory, and him and Rogue got married and had a kid in that. And then when after that storyline was done, they had this younger version of Magneto who appeared in the comics, and they kind of like were setting up a Gambit, Magneto, Rogue love triangle in the comics for a brief time. Turned out he was a clone of Magneto, and it's comic book stuff, all that kind of stuff. But so it's one of those storylines that's always been kind of like teased around the edges in the comics. They did a little bit with it in about like 10 years ago in the comics too. But I feel like they really did it justice in this series, and they really kind of explored what that relationship would be like.
Yeah. Yes. Just yes to that. Also, it gives us a little something. It gives us a little more soap opera stuff to think about, but it also gives us a little kind of, now that you are talking about the comics and you mentioned the kind of different comic line with Apocalypse, you're kind of saying a little bit of what's going on in that last episode too. If you maybe, yeah. I'm wondering if that's where they're gonna go with that. That's interesting.
I'm not sure. It's gonna be very interesting, because they go back in time and they see the young Apocalypse. So it looks like it might be pulling some stuff from the Rise of Apocalypse story, where it went over his origins. I'm very what comic they're pulling from this. It was clear, because the end of 92, it ends with Xavier going off into space. Magneto has helped out the X-Men to help Xavier go out into space. So kind of that we were going for like the mid 80s vibe, when Magneto had taken over the school and he was a member of the X-Men, and
Mm-hmm.
that we would probably go into some stuff with Inferno and Madeline Pryor. So all that stuff made sense to me. And they mixed in some other stuff here and there. The Genosha destruction came from the Grant Morrison one. Prince and Bastion, that came from the storyline in the mid-late 90s. The Magneto, basically declaring war on humanity, that came from the Fatal Attraction story. And then they had the moment where he pulls the adamantium from Wolverine's body, also straight out of the comics too.
Oh, okay.
So they're doing a really cool job of pulling from all these different eras and fitting it together in a way that actually made a whole lot of sense. I mean, the Madeline Pryor storyline was kind of a mess because the writer's original intention for that was not that she was going to be a clone of Jean. It's just she was going to be a human woman who happened to resemble Jean, and Scott was going to marry her, have a kid, and then retire. And that was kind of like the idea. And then another writer pitched this idea of bringing the original X-Men back together, resurrecting Jean Grey. And so then they kind of Frankenstein this all together. In just 3 episodes, they condensed 5 years of stories into just 3 half-hour episodes.
Really?
And they did a pretty damn good job with it. Yeah. Yeah.
They did. It's very cohesive. The only thing that, and this is just me being me, the only thing I'm thinking is, if Madeline Pryor is a clone of Jean, is Madeline Pryor, could she also be Phoenix? Or is Phoenix just for Jean Grey? Right?
So in the comics, the Phoenix Force has an affinity for Jean Grey, but it's also been used by other people, like Rachel Summers, Jean and Scott's daughter from the future. She had the Phoenix Force at one point.
Okay.
Recently in the Avengers comics, Echo, who also had her own Marvel TV show, she had the Phoenix Force for a brief time. There was also the Avengers vs. X-Men crossover where the Phoenix Force was split among 5 X-Men. So it was Cyclops, Emma Frost, Colossus, Magic, and Namor all shared the Phoenix Force. So the Phoenix Force can be used by many different people, but it does seem to have an affinity for Jean.
Oh, okay. That's how that works.
And
that's also why she said the Phoenix Force has left me at in episode 9 or 10. I don't know. But yeah.
And actually in the original comics, there was a retcon that said that the Phoenix Force didn't actually possess Jean. It basically just recreated itself in Jean's image. And so when the Phoenix Force died at the end of Dark Phoenix, it wasn't actually Jean who died. She was somewhere else healing. So it was this weird kind of comics. They get weird. But I do want to say one of the disappointing aspects of this show is we didn't see more of Punk Storm, because this was a whole storyline in the comics where Storm was powerless and she led the X-Men without powers. And this was her punk era in the mid 80s. And it was the most badass Storm has ever been, was when she had no powers.
Well, was she, because I noticed they did a whole redesign. Was she drawn like that in that comic? How she looks on the series?
Yes, kind of did this. It's funny. They kind of did this backwards evolution of Nine, because in the original series, she had the design from the 90s comics with the white outfit and all this. But comics, the kind of black outfit she wears at the end series, that was her original costume. And then she went from that into the punk look, and then from that into the white look. So they kind of did it in reverse here.
Okay. So you kind of cut out a little bit. So you were saying that the black suit is older than the...
Yes, yeah. The black suit that wears at the end of season 1 here, that is her original costume in the comics. And from there in the comics, she evolved into the punk suit. And then the punk suit, eventually she went to long hair again, but with just a standard full body black suit. And then she went into the white suit in the early 90s. So they kind of did the reverse of it here, where she starts off with the white suit, then she goes to the punk look briefly, and then she goes to her original black costume.
Okay, so now while we're talking about Storm, I would love to know because, of course, with Storm, I know at some point in the comics, she was married to Black Panther, T'Challa Black Panther.
Yeah.
And, of course, we see her here with Forge, who's part of the X-Force, right?
So he was
Or is
originally
he...
part of the X-Men. Yeah, and then later he joined X Factor, and then he's kind of between like the X-Men here and there on the edges. Now he's a member of X-Force in the current comics, if I'm not mistaken. But he kind of started off just like here, where he was designing weapons for the government. So that comes from the comics. And then, if you remember in the original animated series, he was leading X Factor in the Iceman episode and so that also came from the comics, was him leading X Factor. And so, yeah, the Black Panther stuff, that only came about in the mid-aughts, I want to say, early 2010s.
Okay.
But she was with Forge. Like, Forge was like her first love interest in the comics.
Oh, okay. I totally didn't know that. So this really did take basically from this is basically all the comics put together and done very well.
This is basically Chris Claremont's greatest hits from the 80s. Anything they didn't touch on in the original 92 series, which he pulled from a lot of Claremont stuff, they did here. Like, the first half of it is 80s comics, and then the second half they pull from a mix of like 90s and early aughts comics.
This is just there's so much here. It's so rich, and now I understand why it's so rich, because it has a lot of stuff to pull from. You know, it's almost like you could study this, you know, as a writer. I don't know how you feel about it, of course, as a writer, but to me as a writer, I could just sit and I could just study this. There's good character study things you can do here. There's good story structure that you can study here. There's just so much that you can learn just from this season and how they put it all together, and the fact that they've kind of gone through all these comic book lines. I'm just thinking about the stacks of comic books that they would have to go through.
Yeah, there's a lot here. I mean, but also they push the politics of it even further than the comics have really done, I think, in a lot of ways. Like the episode with Xavier and the Shi'ar, when, you know, they're telling him to like renounce his memories and all that, and then he pulls them all into the astral plane, and he takes them to school about the horrors and the evils of colonization and imperialism, which was something that had never happened in the comics. And looking at that, the whole Shi'ar stuff always felt a little odd to me. It never quite fit to the X-Men the way I thought it should, and I could never really articulate why until I saw that episode. It's like, oh, obviously the X-Men are all about coexistence and all this stuff, and imperialism is like the complete opposite of that. It's subjugation. So why would the X-Men be buddy-buddy with this imperialist aggressive empire? Right.
Yeah.
And that episode perfectly illustrated that. And I was so... Because that episode, I was kind of like, whatever. After Remember It, this is kind of a letdown, it feels. I'm not so interested in Xavier and the Shi'ar. But when it got to that end part, I'm like, oh, now I'm in.
Yeah, it pulls it all back together. I'm totally with you there, too. Because in kind of the beginning of that, I was like, what's really going on here? I'm like, do we really need this? It almost felt like it was a diversion from the story. Like they were just going back to say, hey, here's what's happened to, you know, Professor X, because, you know, he's not really dead, you know. So here's what's going on with him. And I'm like, why are we learning about this? But it's like a kind of a foil. It almost, you know, gives you kind of a foil at that point. Like when they start pulling everything together at the end of that episode, you get this feeling like you're mirroring something here. You're showing us something that maybe we are, right? Like you're saying, the politics are being pushed here. But I want to add to that to say that the politics, I think, are being pushed because of, again, this is the genius of writing this or of creating this in this time. This is why this, if it was just a reboot or if it was just a rehash, it wouldn't do it. But in this time, especially like in America, with all of the division that's going on, with all of the laws that are taking us back to a time where we look like that society, that Shi'ar society, it's taking us kind of back that way, and actually showing that in contrast to, what was supposed to be a lovely time on Genosha, and what was supposed to be the UN going forward with mutants and coexistence and all of that kind of stuff, what was supposed to be happening, and showing that no, we're really actually not as far as we think we are. The sense that I get out of it. And that's why this works better than just a rehash, because it is speaking, I think, to the times that we're in right now.
Oh, absolutely. And
yeah,
one of the things that drove me nuts about the discourse around this show was they made the X-Men woke. Bitch, please, the X-Men have always been woke as hell. Like, I grew up in a conservative family. My grandfather adored Ronald, and nobody ever questioned conservative values. He was the patriarch. Nobody questioned that at all. X-Men made me a progressive. I'm a progressive because of the X-Men, right? Because I did not get that at all from my home life.
Yeah, I mean, well, again, X-Men is written in a different time, but when the 90s show came on, you kind of have to think about like what was kind of going on then. People thought that, oh yeah, we're in a time where we're all getting together and and we've gotten past the whatever in the 80s, and we're all kind of coming together, and it's like, are you kidding me?
It was smokescreen. Yeah.
Right.
Complete smokescreen. Yeah.
It's like get real, get real. This is not what you think it is. And, to have that shown in that way. And that's one thing about X-Men that I've always kind of gravitated towards. And one of the big themes of just anything X-Men, but especially this X-Men animated series, is to point out the flaws around race and the wokeness that we need to be as a society. It kind of points that out in an obvious but not obvious way. Right.
And I think too, the changes they made to Batman. In the comics, Batman was just kind of like, he didn't have much of a personality. He was just like kind of a standard evil supervillain type of guy. He was just kind of like this cold, calculating villain. But here, they make him like kind of charming in a way. And he's like, he's funny. He's got this, charisma to him. And I think that was smart because they really kind of show the allure of fascism to a lot of people, and how it can be misleading in that way. And I thought that was a really good way of hitting on what we're seeing right now in many countries around the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're right about that. And also kind of the backstory of how, he became who he is something that you see kind of, this is how a lot of people who hate kind of grow into this, right? They're other already, or they feel they're other already, and so they grow into somebody who hates because they have been singled out to a certain extent.
Exactly.
And then to hear how he created his army is also hitting home, is the only way I can really say that. because he mentioned we are getting these humans because these humans have been laid off by some mutant who can do 7 times the work that they can because they're 7 times as strong. So, so basically, this whole, fear of being replaced has created this racist army. He's created this racist army who are basically also mutants at this point. But it's a lot of, it really did hit home, I think, or it really does kind of show what's going on, at least in American society right now. The reason why there's a lot of let's go back to the 1800s is because people fear that they are being replaced because they see more people who look more like America on TV, and they're like, oh my gosh, we're about to be replaced. And it nonsensical, but at the same time, when you combine it with a leader who has the charm that Bastion has, like you're saying, and the charisma that he has, and the ability to speak to them, right? Because again, this army is kind of controlled by him. So if you kind of think about it, it is really mirroring a lot of kind of what's going on right now, which is A, scary, but B, now we kind of see, you kind of get a picture of how people can be lured in this way, right? And how people can.
So I'm very curious to see where they're going to go from this, because it's already been greenlit for seasons 2 and 3. So
it has. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, they greenlit season 2 before season 1 even came out. That's how confident they were in what they were seeing. Wow. And season 2, I know they're going to be pulling some from the Grant Morrison run, because they already said that they're going to be bringing the costumes from that Frank Lee design for the Grant Morrison comic books, which were like these black leather costumes wore with these big yellow X's on the jackets. So that's going to be coming in season 2. So too, I love that they went back to their classic costumes for the end of this series. Yeah. Like Wolverine, Jean Grey, they're wearing these kind of like classic X-Men outfits.
Yeah, and it's funny too, because I always have Easter eggs. That was the one thing I actually wanted to mention. And one of the Easter eggs was that they made a joke about, because I think it was Sunspot, they were giving him his costume, and they were like, and they were saying, so
it was a cape.
Yeah. Yeah. So they were like, so what? Were you expecting black leather? And that was a nod to the first X-Men movie, where they said, so what, did you want spandex? Yeah.
Yes.
I was like, oh my gosh, this is just full of stuff. But one thing I noticed that it was full of, and the last 3 episodes, Tolerances, Extinctions, part 1, 2, and 3, those episodes were just pure genius. They just had a lot of, they had a lot of thematic things, because we saw the Summers family fighting the bad guy together. We saw the explanation about why, I can't remember what her name is, but why she let Magneto go. I don't know how this necessarily hit you, Perry, but for me, the first thing I thought of when she said, it's surprising that all this bloodshed happened on Genosha. One thing struck me was that nobody was surprised. None of the mutants were surprised. And I immediately thought of the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, because on social media, a lot of the Gen X, I'll say us Gen Xers, I'm a Gen Xer, and older, were not surprised by what happened, because of the racism over the years and what that does, and the brutality and everything like that. And that didn't surprise us. But for a lot of the younger generations, especially Gen Z, they were the ones who really were the ones who mobilized, right? Because they were surprised and they were angry and they were on Twitter talking about it. And the Black Lives Matter movement started. And they were surprised because they are, the younger generation who hasn't gone through that cycle of racist oppression and systematic oppression. They thought they were free of it, right?
Well, I was gonna say, did you ever see Hassan Minaj's Homecoming King comedy special?
No, I haven't.
So
Now I'm gonna have to find
really
it.
good, and it's really good. It's on Netflix, I believe.
Okay, good.
And at one point, talking about 9/11, and because he was a teenager, he was in high school when 9/11 happened, and he's talking about, and his father was an immigrant. He was born in America, though. Hassan was, and his father was an immigrant, and they had someone attack their house because he's Muslim from India, his family, and they had some people attack his house after 9/11, and I think they threw like a brick in his car or something like that. I don't remember what it was exactly. It's something like that. And his father just very quietly comes out and sweeps up the glass very quickly and goes inside. And then Hassan Minaj, he was talking to his father, and he's like, why are you accepting this? Right? Why are you just, not doing anything about this? And his father said, these things happen. This is the price we pay to be here. And he talked in his special how the tax, and he says, when you come to a country, you kind of feel like, here's the price you pay to be an American, right? You're gonna have to put up with some racism, you're gonna have to put up with some discrimination, and you just have to take it, is the idea that like a lot of first generation immigrants feel. But him being someone who was born in America, he's like, no, I'm an American citizen, I have rights. And it kind of makes me think too, it's not exactly one-to-one translation, but it does feel like a similar idea where generations, they had to put up with a lot more of the more overt forms of racism. And so the younger generations, when they're confronted with it, all of a sudden, after years of just, microaggressions and the kind of like thinly veiled racism, the dog whistling, and now they're confronted with full-on overt racism, they're like, hold on, wait a second, this is not right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sorry. I don't have the words because I'm feeling the feelings. That's also part of what makes X-Men, for me, what makes the X-Men a little bit more, I feel a little bit differently watching it. I feel, versus watching something that has, something Avengers or a DC comic series. It's a whole different, I feel it on a personal level that I don't on with any other superhero kind of thing. And it's really brought out in those last 3 episodes there. It just kind of all comes together. But what I really wanted to say kind of before we left things is that I was talking about before is the amount of Easter eggs here. And obviously this is part of the Marvel universe, even though if you're coming into it being a watcher versus a comic book nerd, I'm gonna say, because we love our comic book nerds, you don't realize that you are in the Marvel universe. But seeing all these cameos of other characters from other comic book lines like Spider-Man and Daredevil and Iron Man, and I believe I saw Bastion talking to Dr. Doom, which, and again, I know this came out before the San Diego Comic-Con, but me watching it after the announcement at the San Diego Comic-Con and seeing Dr. Doom, I was like, was that a little foreshadowing there? But there's so many other, comic character appearances that you don't
Yeah.
normally think of when you're thinking of X-Men.
There's
You
this
know,
entire shared continuity of all these different Marvel 90s shows that came out, like Iron Man, Fantastic
yes.
Four,
Mm-hmm.
Incredible Hulk, Silver Surfer, and of course, Spider-Man 94, the most famous of those, which actually did have a crossover with the X-Men back in the 90s. And in fact, the Spider-Man we see there, and I think it's in those last 3 episodes, we see
Mm-hmm.
Peter and Mary Jane from
Yes.
their looks at the end of Spider-Man 94. So they're stepping in there. And they said too that in the next season, I think they're gonna have more crossovers. They're gonna more firmly establish that universe. So it's gonna be really interesting to see what they have, because it's full on 90s influence. So it's really cool, because that's when I into comics, was these shows.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to say for me, it started off with X-Men, and I've said this I believe, in my first episode. This is why Nerdy Romantics podcast exists. It exists because in the 90s, I was a full-on nerd, but I was also I loved romance novels and things like that. And X-Men, the animated series, was one of those influences. But also with that, X-Men got me started watching other superhero animated series. And, one of the ones that I liked that I don't think started off as a comic, it started off as a cartoon, was Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. That was one of the ones I was kind of into. And
yeah, Firestar,
yes, Firestar was
in that
a
series.
girl.
And funny enough, she ended up, her first step in the comics was through the X-Men comics.
Oh, wow. That's so awesome. I love it. I love the connections. Yeah. And 2, it's also, to me, showing that I think we're going to get a lot more connections than what we've had. Like, now that Disney pretty much owns just about all of the characters now. I don't think they totally own Do they totally own Spider-Man yet?
Spider-Man, no. Spider-Man,
Sony?
the movie, yes. Spider-Man's movie rights are still owned by Sony, and so they have an agreement with Marvel to do the Tom Holland movies. But that's why Sony can do like Venom and Morbius and Madam Web and all that kind of stuff. But the Spider-Man movies, those are being done in cooperation with Marvel. But everything else Disney owned, so they have all the X-Men stuff. They have the TV rights to Spider-Man, as I believe.
Yeah, because they do have the old Spider-Man. I think the one that you're talking about, that comic, not Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, but the one that you were talking about.
No, that was the 94, yeah.
Yeah, they have that. They have so many cartoons that it's just, and I didn't realize this until today. I said, okay, I put all of these on my, I put all of these in my watch list. I'm like, okay, I really want to go back to the 90s, evidently.
They're kind of hit and miss. I think X-Men's probably the best of the bunch. Yeah. The second season of Iron Man was pretty decent. I remember liking Incredible Hulk, but I haven't watched that in a while. And I think Silver Surfer was actually pretty good, too. Fantastic Four was kind of the worst of the bunch. It was apparently, like, universally reviled, so much so they even made fun of it in the comics.
Oh, wow. Well, for some reason, they can't get that right on screen. They can't get that right in animation. But those characters are good characters. I don't know why they can't get that right. I don't understand.
They haven't had anyone who really understands the comic book. I mean, I've seen the new movie they have coming out. It looks like they're finally right with that, though.
Yeah. I agree. So obviously this is kind of a love fest going on here, but we will do a rating for this, 1-star to 5-star rating. So, 1, we didn't like it. 2, it was okay. 3 stars, we liked it. 4 stars, we really liked it. And 5 stars, it was amazing. So, Perry, what about you?
Can we go above 5? Because my God, like, I don't know if 5 even does it. It's so good.
It is. It's so, I'm gonna agree with you on the star rating. It's just so good. There's just so much in here. And, we've been talking for over an hour, y'all, but we've like barely scratched the surface, I feel like, in some respects, because there's so much here. And I can't wait for the next 2 seasons. Oh my gosh, I'm
Yep.
so happy about this. I'm so excited about this. But Perry, it was a total joy talking with you about X-Men 97. First off, I am glad that you talked me into doing a podcast episode about it, even though I think I knew in the back of my mind I was probably going to do one. But I'm glad you asked, hey, are you going to do a podcast episode? Because I had to talk about this with somebody, not just talking about it on the podcast.
I'm surprised that you hadn't seen it, because back when we first met, when you came on my show, you would how much 90s X.
Yeah, exactly. And when I heard about it, I was like, I thought I was just going to jump right in, but life got in the way.
Yeah, that always happens.
Yeah, it does. It does. But Perry, what do you have going on in writer world? What's going on with you? Let us know what's out maybe now, or what you have coming out, if you have something coming out soon. And also for anybody new, where we can find you.
Sure. Well, I'm in a weird place right now at the time of recording, because I have started releasing a Power Rangers style superhero serial called Omega Knights, and I've been publishing that through the reamstories.com platform, but that platform's had some issues at the time this morning, so I'm not sure if I'm going to stay there. But if you go to personalconstantine.com, you can sign up for my mailing list, and you can get all the updates about where it's going to end up, and I'll be posting it on the news on the website there. And if you want to hear me talk more about superheroes, I've got a podcast called Superhero Cinephiles, which you've been on before, and we talked about superhero romance. Yes. And that's superherocinephiles.com and all the podcast platforms. And if you like Japanese movies, I also have a podcast where I discuss Japanese film. That's called Japan on Film, which is japanonfilm.com. And you can just go to percivalconstantine.com to find my hub for basically everything.
Sounds great. So, Perry, I got to have you on for the next superhero, whatever it is. I will say, though, I am halfway through season 3 of Superman and Lois, which we've talked about on the podcast here. Good one. And yes. I kind of think I want to talk about that with you, because that is a good one.
I'm always down to talk about Superman and Lois.
Yes. All right. So that may be in a future episode. So if you are not subscribed, you got to subscribe so you can hear it. Thanks, Perry, for coming on and talking with me about X-Men 97.
Thank you.
Hi. Want to get show notes from this and future episodes in your inbox? Then subscribe to Nerdy Romantics newsletter at nerdyromanticspodcast.com/subscribe. Nerdy Romantics newsletter not only has show notes, but nerdy and romantic recs and sneak peeks and exclusives of my spicy nerdy romances and love stories. I love talking sci-fi, superheroes, fantasy, and romance books, movies, and shows with my friends. So share this podcast with your nerdy romantic friends. Thanks for listening and for watching. Stardate, not too distant future. Brandon is a diehard Trekkie. He's watched every Star Trek franchise episode multiple times. He has several cosplay and collectible uniforms in his closet. Commander Will Riker is his favorite cosplay character, and he's been to dozens of conventions. But he's never met or gotten in a fight with another Trekkie like Phoenix. Phoenix is looking forward to her first Star Trek convention until she meets Brandon. He's nothing like the Riker character she loves to hate. He's combative, socially awkward, and off-putting. But he's so adorable. Phoenix and Brandon keep running into each other, each time more heated than the next. With 3 days of convention to get through, will they get past the hostility and find what they know is there? Attraction and perhaps love? This is the premise of Stardate, a free e-story for my newsletter subscribers, available on February 1st. If you like Trekkie romance, romantic comedy, or just like to see a little grumpy sunshine trope, this story is for you. Go to ymnelson.com/subscribe and get your free copy.